space, cyber whatever, cyber, and now cyber ribbons. What could this be? And it says in the title of today's presentation, healing and recovery from illness. So it has some recovery, some medical effect on it. That's the topic that we will be discussing today. Cyber ribbons, the influence of online support groups on healing and recovery from illness. And this is part of the first Eastern Illinois University Technology and Science Symposium, and it is it's seen as revolution in science and technology paradigm. Who could imagine that cyber would be related to ribbons, and ribbons would be support, and it would be healing from illnesses? And it's my pleasure to introduce Crystal Duncan Lane, a professor at the School of Family and Consumer Sciences here at Eastern Illinois University. And without much ado, here is Crystal clear.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am Crystal Duncan Lane, and I'm happy to be here today. And my presentation is on cyber ribbons, the influence of internet support groups on healing from illness. And so I'll be talking about how I see ribbons on the internet and how this connects to certain types of healing. And forgive me as I have to turn around to forward my slides. So why am I interested? My dissertation focused on women with a history of breast cancer. I was trying to figure out how I could measure family resilience in this population, and so I looked at internet support groups on the internet. And so I used these groups. They were specifically for women, specifically with a history of breast cancer. And what happened was I stumbled on a phenomenon that currently I have not been able to find in the literature. And I do hope to start a project on it starting in the spring of 2014. What happened was I went into a group for women with stage 4 breast cancer. So for those of you who aren't aware of what that is, stage 4 breast cancer means that the cancer has metastasized throughout the body, and the person is then considered to be terminally ill or dying. And so what happened was these women talked with me about feeling unsupported, by feeling stigmatized by this pink ribbon movement, and they had this desperation to have a voice. And I had not heard of that. I've still not heard of it anywhere except in a couple of books. And so I plan to start studying this hopefully next semester. And what's very interesting to me is that if the internet were not there, if this support group were not there specifically for women with this issue, they likely would not be as together. They wouldn't feel as supported. They actually may very well be having a better existence just because they are able to have this time together in an online format. And so that's something I want to study. So that's what got me thinking about this whole idea of internet support groups. So to start out, I want to define what I'm talking about with regards to ribbons. And I know you've seen these out and about as you go out and you're walking around, you see people with ribbons. And they can mean a myriad of things. Normally it's a ribbon, it's a satin ribbon, and it's folded, and the color is where the meaning is derived. Some ribbons are more readily recognized than others. And so they tend to be worn to demonstrate some type of solidarity for a cause. So the pink ribbon, this is October, it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, this whole pink ribbon idea. We run for the cure, all of this various stuff. The Komen Foundation has the pink ribbon as part of its logo. We see it everywhere. And so that's what I'm talking about with regards to these ribbons. But there are ribbons that symbolize pretty much any cause, any condition, any social situation or social issue. And some colors symbolize different things, so you have to understand the context. But for this presentation, I'm talking about it in terms of illness. So the origins of these ribbons, I had a hard time actually finding a definitive, this is where they came from and this is where they started. Some say it goes all the way back to the day of Napoleon, because he talked about the importance of winning or fighting for ribbons. Others talk about it with this 1973 song called Tie Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree. And the thing was, we tied yellow ribbons around trees if we had a loved one who was fighting in a war. In 1992, red ribbons began symbolizing AIDS awareness, HIV and AIDS awareness, and there was the Year of the Ribbon, which was also 1992. And in the 90s is when we started to see this explosion of ribbons. I was in college at this time, and I remember seeing people with just, 10, 20 ribbons on their backpacks and having no idea what most of them meant. That's another way that I got very interested in these. So just with regards to cancer, this is the American Cancer Society Relay for Life ribbon list. And so you see here breast cancer is pink. And it isn't that they're always one color. Sometimes you have different colors. Sometimes we have stripes. It's the gamut. But the American Cancer Society has accepted these colors as a representation for these different types of cancer. Okay. And so ribbons in the internet, it's really actually very interesting. So the use of ribbons to demonstrate solidarity for a cause came about, well, it exploded around the same time that the US population began to become very interested in the internet and started to get the internet in their homes. And so what we started to see is that there are many different types of internet support groups as there are ribbons. And we usually see these ribbons as being on the sites for these internet support groups. And so there are many reasons that these groups are important. It's the same reason that we actually wear ribbons. Solidarity, building community, raising awareness. And especially when illness and disease are the primary concern, it's easy to look up symptoms in a basic internet search. I'm sure everyone in this room has done this. I've done it myself, and then usually all of these horrendous illnesses come up and we think something terrible, and it's very easy to become panicked. And people make jokes about this phenomenon, but it is very easy to become panicked if we really don't have someone to bounce these things that we're finding off of. And so internet illness support groups can be a place to do that if we don't necessarily have access to a healthcare provider as readily as some. And so there's this idea of virtual community building. And I like to think of this in terms of these support groups are providing support to folks who are isolated. And that isolation can take many forms, and so that's what I have focused on in a large part of this presentation. There's geographic isolation, physical, socioemotional, consequential, identity isolation, and rarity isolation. And I'm going to talk about what each of these means. Some are probably more obvious than others. So geographic isolation, this is living in a rural area that may not have the potential for isolate, or that has an increase in the potential for isolation. We have this thing called HPSAs, okay? Health Professional Shortage Areas. This is a designation by HRSA, which is part of the federal government. And these areas have a shortage of primary medical care, primary dental care, and primary mental health care, sometimes all three, sometimes just one. And specialized medical care is often non-existent in these areas, which means if there is something happening that is serious, that goes beyond going to the doctor for antibiotics or a cold or a flu, for example, there's going to be a great deal of travel in some instances to see a healthcare professional, and that travel in itself can be costly, especially if the person doesn't have the resources or a vehicle. And so internet illness support groups can actually help folks in these areas know if they should go, when they should go, what's normal, what's not normal. Is it worth the investment to go seek out a medical health professional? And of course the ideal here would be they would be able to go and see a physician and see a healthcare provider. But as someone who's worked as a healthcare provider in the rural South, that is not the reality by far. And we would actually have folks in the surgical practice where I worked as a family therapist driving 8 hours just to come and be seen because this particular person had breast cancer. And so this idea of cost, especially for someone who isn't feeling well already, it can be huge. So this is very important. Physical isolation, this is one that we're probably the most familiar with. This is the idea of people who literally cannot leave their homes because they don't have the means. They cannot physically get out on their own. They need help to do that. And so being able to have access to the internet and to look up these groups, of course they have to be aware these groups exist, can help circumvent this isolation, this physical isolation. And it can provide crucial socio-emotional support for folks who may be living alone. One of the words that comes to mind is people who are called shut-ins. I hate that term, but it is fairly accurate, especially for people who are older. And so this could become a crucial avenue for support in their lives. Socio-emotional isolation. This is something I'm familiar with as a mental health provider. And these are folks who, they may be physically able to leave their homes, but they cannot leave because of crippling anxiety or fears that to them are very real. So generalized anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, people are not actually physically able to get up and go places because their systems are so depressed. Grief and bereavement, agoraphobia, a fear of open spaces, latrophobia, which is a fear of healthcare professionals, and I think it's trypanophobia, which is a fear of needles, and these are just two phobias associated with the healthcare profession. There are many. And there could be many, many reasons why someone may not leave their home. We've all heard of these stories of someone who hasn't left their home for years. But it is a very real issue, and people in these situations often need health care. And so this can be another way for them to know, okay, is it worth it to take this risk to leave my house and open myself up to all of these fears or a possible panic attack? Consequential isolation. This one is actually fairly large. This is people with an illness or a disease that society views as shameful. And so prior to Nancy Reagan's admission of having breast cancer, I believe that was the 80s, breast cancer was one of those diseases. I'll come back to stage 4 breast cancer and what that means in a moment. But just think about how you would feel if someone said to you, I have HIV, I have some type of an STI, I have anorexia, or impotence, or depression, or any mental illness, or I'm addicted to OxyContin, for example. All of these things are viewed as shameful by our society, and of course people that have these issues are going to be less likely to seek out treatment because of that shaming, which often can happen in the healthcare office. And so this is a huge place where people come together for solidarity and to know, okay, should I go in or not? Stage 4 breast cancer, this is actually viewed as shameful in some circles. The women that I spoke to on this BC Met's website, this website for women who are actually dying of breast cancer, they told me stories such as, the moment my doctor diagnosed me with stage 4, I felt like he stopped caring. I didn't matter anymore because I wasn't living anymore. Or people who are into this pink ribbon movement, they don't allow for people to be in pain. They don't allow for people to have any type of a story that isn't happy and resilient and sometimes even infantilized, because if you think about what we typically see with that pink ribbon, there's rarely anything about it that is dark or painful. We usually see angels or children associated with it. So there's very little space for actual suffering, which is a large part of this illness. And so these women talked about feeling ashamed of saying they had stage 4 breast cancer. And so this internet support group was vital for them. Rarity. So this is a rare illness where someone can feel completely alone. They have no idea even if what they're experiencing is real, if that makes sense. Male breast cancer is a large one. Even though more and more people are aware of this, it can also be viewed as something that's shameful. Believing we're the only one experiencing something, and just thinking we're alone can increase psychological stress. That can lead to an increase in our physiological, or a decrease in our physiological health. And so just knowing we aren't alone is important. We can think about how very effective 12-step programs are for people with addiction, for example. This whole idea of just coming together with a common issue, people heal at an astronomically high rate. And so this whole idea of I'm no longer alone can be very powerful. And I put BC Mets here because that's the website that I was using when I came upon this experience of stage 4 breast cancer that these women had. Identity isolation. This is one we tend to scoff at unless we're in one of these positions, and there are probably many more. These are some of the ones that I know of. This is anyone who is a public figure, who is known in a community, who may not want to be known as having an illness. For example, a public official who may be up for election, for example. Someone, a judge who is getting ready to rule on a case. Religious officiates, educators, business owners, actors. And so the medium of the internet provides for us to be anonymous, which we'll talk about in a minute as a negative or a potential negative. But these folks can actually receive support without revealing who they are or that they have whatever issue it is that they're struggling with. And someone who's actually known as having used the internet for support is Elizabeth Edwards. She used internet illness support groups after the loss of her son, after he was tragically killed in a car accident, during her experience with breast cancer, her many experiences with breast cancer, including metastatic breast cancer, and also as she was dying from breast cancer, the infidelity of her husband. So she was able to go online and be anonymous and not be so isolated because she was so popular, which kind of, to me, is almost a weird irony. And then there's this idea of compound isolation, and that is a very simple concept. It's basically the more types of isolation that we have, the worse off we could possibly be, because there's this potential for feeling alone, for feeling shamed, for having something physiological or psychological going on that keeps us from being able to leave our house. And so the more isolated we are, the more support that we need, which means that the more of these types of isolation that we have, the more crucial it could be for us to have an internet illness support group in our life. But there are problems. There are negatives, critiques, maybe would be a better way to say this. Of course, you have to have access. Access is the #1 issue. If I am someone who cannot afford the internet, if I'm in a rural area that does not have access, then there goes that. Requires a computer, reliable internet connection, and public computers are not always accessible or private enough for this type of discussion. And so that's the first hurdle. The internet does allow us to be whomever we want to be, which means that I can go into an internet support group and say I have this illness just for the sake of getting a thrill. And then I'm in there misrepresenting. It's easy to be invisible. It's easy to be dishonest. It is a positive for people who are trying to hide their identity. It's a negative for people who isolate themselves as a symptom of their diagnosis. So for people who have major depression, for example, social isolation can actually be a symptom of their diagnosis, and it's a sign they're getting worse. And so if going to an internet support group is being used when there's other support out there, that actually could be a negative. It's also easy to be a bully. We see that if you go onto YouTube or any public site where there can be comments, there's always negative comments happening. And so there are things that could be seen as barriers. Of course, there's also advice that should only come from a medical professional. That is the ideal. But again, if someone isn't willing or able, it could be the next best thing. Any interaction is also coming through the biases and worldviews of the members. And so it's possible to get bad advice. This certainly isn't a catch-all or a miracle solution, but it's something. It's difficult to conduct accurate research on these groups as well, to try and figure out how many are out there, what do they cover, how many people are members, it's just very difficult to do any type of research. And the literature review that I did for this resulted, I mean, the limitations in the journal articles were almost as long as the actual articles themselves. And so it's hard to get an accurate read on what really is out there. Although if you Google any condition, there will usually be a support group for it. Still, the benefits to these populations when there is nothing else there do far outweigh risks. And so there is a great potential for them to be a service for folks with this type of isolation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do y'all have questions?
I think I have a question.
All right.
If someone has to go to the internet to seek some advice or some support just to vent, is this part of the process, just to say what you want to say to somebody, like talking to the wall, for example?
Absolutely. Being able to go in there and say, I hate this disease, and you know, I wish if I could see it, I would beat it up and do this to it. That can actually be very therapeutic. That's actually what therapists would do in a therapy room with someone with an illness. And so it can be very therapeutic. Where it can be a barrier is what the person they're venting to is saying back. So if they're saying, just suck it up, you know, be a man or be a woman or what have you, that might not help. But by the same token, just getting it out can help.
Talking about getting it out, I hear about some people who would talk to their pets, to get the dog and talk to the dog. Are there any fears or dangers of doing this? I mean, talking to your wardrobe, talking to your jacket, talking to a dog, talking to a non-human element. I mean, just to vent.
I would say that getting it out in general can be good, but it would depend on how that person is making sense of whatever they're talking to. And so if I'm just standing here talking to an empty room, it can make me feel a release. But by the same token, if I think I'm talking to someone who's sitting right there and there's no one there, that could be a sign there's something going on mental illness-wise. Or if I rely more on my dog, for example, than the advice of a child or an adult child or a physician, that could certainly be an issue. And so it depends on the context and the mental health of that person.
Now, generally speaking, we talk about people who talk to themselves. If you see somebody walking and talking to himself or herself, usually you feel kind of weird or crazy or something. Are they really crazy or they are really wise? I don't know.
It depends. If it's someone who is talking to themselves because of dementia or because of some type of mental illness where they really believe they're having a conversation with someone who isn't there, that could be an issue, or it could be very beneficial to them. It all depends. If it's someone who's just out and they're venting and they're talking and they don't think anyone sees them, that's something else altogether. And for children actually do have that self-talk before they internalize it. So early children will do that, except they're usually talking about what they're doing, like, you know, okay, I'm putting on my shoe and I'm tying my shoe, as opposed to venting about their day.
A 3, 4, 5 years of age child, would you encourage them to talk to Cinderella or some figures of stories and live for 5 minutes, 10 minutes with whatever character in the stories?
A 3, 4, or 5-year-old might not be able to cognitively understand that. I might encourage someone in middle childhood who might feel socially isolated or might have issues with trust to tell this story to this puppet I have here, but only if there's someone in the room who can hear it too. Because sometimes it's less threatening for a child to talk to a puppet than to a person. But for the 3, 4, 5, that may be a little young for that.
Very good. Any other questions?
I'm sorry I had to miss your whole talk. I couldn't hear. But related to what you were just talking about, you know, reading about him was that when he was very young, you know, people tell you stories about how he didn't speak till somewhat later. And one thing that he did was he always, whenever he was about to say something, he would whisper it to himself before he said it sort of out loud. That was when he was sort of just learning how to talk, maybe 3 or 4 years old or so. what does that relate to?
That can actually be a symptom of something that I feel can actually be an obsessive thing, but it can be functional too.
Right, I think in his case it was probably functional, yeah. Because, yeah, really.
And given the fact that he became what he ended to be, could it be a sign of genius or something? I don't know.
I think so, absolutely. I tend to see genius where others don't, so who knows? I hope I do.
Last question. Once teacher was punished by the school master because she told her, not kindergarten, but 2 years or 3 more over kindergarten, that Santa Claus is not real. Because she noticed that students are talking about him as real and even having fantasies about Santa Claus and so forth. So she felt she had to tell them the truth. So the parents sued her or asked for her punishment because she ruined Christmas for their families and their. So how would you deal with something like that?
Wow.
I guess my question would be, would you hide for people who want support? Would you hide the truth like Santa Claus, like this teacher did, to give them the right thing? Or keep it until they are 10 years and maybe they will understand on their own? Because some people still at 20s, they feel that Santa Claus is real.
I know.
Or they replace it with believing in other things, other than Santa Claus, that are not real, but they are trained to believe unreal things.
I think we can be trained to believe a lot of unreal things as children and adults. I think it all comes back to context and the mental health of the person that we're talking to, and especially in the context of this presentation with internet illness support groups. I would say that in the American culture, we do need to be honest about what's going on with someone. In other cultures, that's actually seen as disrespectful. I can't remember, I believe it may be a subset of Chinese culture believes that a healthcare provider should actually give news that someone is dying, not to the person, but to their loved one. But that's completely different with American medicine. And so I would say that, what I would say is that in the United States, a lot of that's governed by law. Even though in some cases it may be better left to the family. With regards to Santa Claus, I don't know. I'd love to know more about the school system and the other teachers and how they taught, and if this person was new or if they had a bad experience, who knows. Yeah, I would like to know more about what happened there.
But maybe it is a topic for your next presentation next year.
Maybe so.
Crystal clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So why am I interested? My dissertation focused on women with a history of breast cancer. I was trying to figure out how I could measure family resilience in this population, and so I looked at internet support groups on the internet. And so I used these groups. They were specifically for women, specifically with a history of breast cancer. And what happened was I stumbled on a phenomenon that currently I have not been able to find in the literature. And I do hope to start a project on it starting in the spring of 2014. What happened was I went to a group for women with stage 4 breast cancer.
Well, cyberspace, cyber whatever, cyber, and now cyber ribbons. What could this be? And it says in the title of today's presentation, healing and recovery from illness. So it has some recovery, some.
So for those of you who aren't aware of what that is, stage 4 breast cancer means that the cancer has metastasized throughout the body, and the person is then considered to be terminally ill or dying. And so what happened was these women talked with me about feeling unsupported, by feeling stigmatized by this pink ribbon movement, and they had this desperation to have a voice. And I had not heard of that. I've still not heard of it anywhere except in a couple of books. And so I plan to start studying this hopefully next semester. And what's very interesting to me is that if the internet were not there, if this
medical effect on it, that's the topic that we would be discussing today. Cyber ribbons, the influence of online support groups on healing and recovery from illness. And this is part of the first Eastern Illinois University Technology and Science Symposium, and it's seen as revolution in science and technology paradigm. Who could imagine that cyber would be related to ribbons, and the ribbons would be support, and it would be healing from illnesses. And it's my pleasure to introduce Crystal Duncan Lane, a professor at the School of Family and Consumer Sciences here at Eastern Illinois University. And without much ado, here is Crystal Clear.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am Crystal Duncan Lane, and I'm happy to be here today. And my presentation is on cyber ribbons, the influence of internet support groups on healing from illness. And so I'll be talking about how I see ribbons on the internet and how this connects to certain types of healing. And forgive me as I have to turn around to forward my slides.